Let me encapsulate what I'm going to say right at the beginning. I'm going to be saying that the transition to decarbonize the global economy is the single biggest opportunity to reconnect science, innovation, and wealth creation since the Industrial Revolution. And I say that because the energy sector is the biggest sector in the global economy. We're talking about an investment by 2020 globally in infrastructure related to energy in all of its manifestations of $3 to $6 trillion a year. That's the size of the new low carbon market, and it's going to be innovative companies that will play into that marketplace. That's my basic message. But before I get round to the detail, I'm just going to position what I'm going to say in terms of my day job, which is managing climate change and speaking for our Foreign Secretary on that subject. So if I could have the first slide. When I was Government Chief Scientific Advisor, 2000 to 2007, we had in Central Europe the worst natural disaster Central Europe has ever experienced, measured in terms of the number of fatalities. 70,000 people died, that's the excess fatalities, during that heat wave in 2003. And what I did was go to our Met Office, who had recently included greenhouse gases into their global weather prediction model for the whole planet, an all-physics model taking into account data from satellites and data from most commercial aircrafts and reinitializing the programs every 6 hours. I went to them and I said, I want you to do something for me. I want you to run your programs backwards in time to the year 1900, and I want you to run them back, reinitializing every 3 weeks over a 9-week period. So there would be 3 different runs with different initial input into the calculation. Now, what I knew would happen is that by the time we put all these curves together, these are the red curves, the weather would look like noise, and the climate change is the drift carrying these curves. Right? So the climate change is the non-noise factor, and the weather is what looks like noise. Because after 6 weeks, I don't predict tomorrow's weather at all well. There's too much chaos in the weather system. But there is very little chaos in the climate change system. And so what you see is the general trend going forward in time. This is a curve. I'm going to step in front of this now. It takes us from 1900 through to 2100. And so that black curve represents the average summer temperature. These are all European summer temperatures. The average summer temperature in Europe going from 1900 to 2003. And that cross up there marks that very hot summer in 2003. Now, I think you can see that I'm going to be arguing that that excess number of fatalities was the world's first climate change-driven catastrophe, because the impact of a hot summer isn't linear with the temperature rise above the norm. It gets worse and worse. It's a cube factor on the temperature rise above the norm. And so if we just look at the baseline temperature rise already occurring due to climate change, this hot summer was considerably hotter than the 1947 hot summer, which was the previous record temperature. But a big part of that difference is the baseline temperature increase due to that drift as greenhouse gases have increased in the atmosphere. Now, if we then extrapolate forward in time, I hope you can see that by 2050, on a medium to high emission scenario, which is the scenario we're on, the average temperature in Central Europe will be the same as that hot summer of 2003. And now comes the important point, because then if we have an extreme hot summer event on top of this baseline, we not only have this temperature, but we sit on one of these extremities. This is something the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes no comment on. If you read their reports, they will tell you what is the most likely challenging temperature into the future, not what happens when you get an extreme weather event sitting on top of that rising baseline. And so these unlikely events are not that unlikely. They happen on quite a frequent basis. And there's the challenge of climate change, encapsulated. When sea levels rise, they challenge the state of Britain because we are an island nation. And so I ran a flood defense analysis for Britain, 2000 to 2003, when I became Chief Scientific Advisor, because I knew that as sea levels rise, when there are storms at sea, there are also storms inland. We get flooded rivers at the same time as our coastlines are under attack, and the incursion of water goes much further than simply the baseline rise in sea level due to the storms at sea. And there's the challenge. We suffered our worst ever floods in 2012-13, and if you saw Britain, it looks like we were underwater. Actually, that was my plan. We saved all our major assets. We had a program in place to deflect floodwaters into floodplains. And what you saw was the floodplains pretty well saturated. But we never lost major assets apart from one railway line. So we can manage these problems. But if we extrapolate forward, we cannot manage these problems going forward in time, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. So my starting point is, we have very little time to transform our global economy into a decarbonized economy. How do we accelerate that process? The next slide simply accentuates this point. This is taking the latest data from NASA, published on Sunday, and it's simply showing temperatures averaged around a zero here, rather arbitrarily chosen, from 1880 through to 2016, and the latest data point is this one up here. So what is happening at the moment is that we've got an El Nino event sitting on this rising baseline. And that again emphasizes what I'm saying. When we have a rising baseline, it's not the average we have to worry about, it's the extreme events, such as an El Nino event. And all of the droughts, the burning of forests that have dried up around the world are driven by this extraordinarily high temperature, and the loss of Arctic sea ice driven by this extraordinarily high temperature. Very quick point, if I can take a dig at any climate skeptics. Climate skepticism takes off in the intervening periods between El Nino events. You don't hear too many climate skeptics right at the moment, but wait till it drops down again, and we'll all hear about the fact that 2016 was far hotter than 2018. That, of course, is to ignore extreme events on a rising baseline. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to say the United Kingdom has acted, I think, very firmly to act on climate change. We introduced a renewable obligation on the grid. I know carbon pricing is very important, but it's quite a sluggish instrument. And we need regulations and obligations as well as carbon pricing to drive through what we need to achieve. And the British government has been using regulation and obligation all the way to the present time. We do need pricing as well. And one reason we need pricing in the European Union is because it locks 28 countries into a process. It focuses the mind. But the price itself has never been a major driver for action. I think the most important thing I want to draw attention to is the Climate Change Act of Parliament. We pushed through in 2008 all-party agreement, 2008, committing all future governments down a pathway to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. Critically important, we then set up a Climate Change Office of Parliament, a Climate Change Committee which reports to the Parliament, and they set carbon budgets every 4 years into the future. It was the private sector, and I was a member of the team that designed this, the private sector pushing us for long-term certainty in the rules of the game. And so having the carbon budgets was driven through by the private sector. We now have budgets to 2028. So while we have reduced our emissions about 30% compared with 1990 today, I can tell you with confidence we will have reduced our emissions by 52% in 2028, and we are now finalizing our budget for 2032, and it's going to be 57%, I'm fairly confident. So we have a long-term commitment into the future, and all party agreement, all governments are bound to that. I think that's really the point I wanted to emphasize here. So next slide. Vicky, if I could have the next slide. Thank you. We've already heard the long-term goal set out in Paris is no more than 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, and if possible 1.5 degrees. Now, I don't think we should simply dismiss those goals. We will only dismiss them at the risk of future generations. This is a really difficult challenge that we have to face, is managing that 2 degrees at the most and 1.5 if possible. And there is a big difference between the impacts on us with 1.5 compared with 2 degrees. I'm just going to move on now to say where we are going and where we should be going. What this curve shows is emissions per annum in billions of tons of carbon dioxide as a function of time from 1990 to 2035. It's a schematic diagram. In red is the IEA's analysis of where we're going, and in green is where we should be going as we go forward in time. And we're not actually on the green curve yet. The next curve I'm going to show you is a more complicated one, but it's got the same axes. Billions of tons per annum on the vertical axis, horizontal axis 2010 to 2100. All we've done here is to add up country by country the commitments made in Paris, those nationally determined contributions. And hopefully colored helpful. This is yellow China, pink India, red USA, European Union, and so on. So the European Union commitment to at least 40% reduction is included in there. And when you get to the top, you've added up all of the national commitments, you'll see a slight fall in emissions over the periods of 2030, which is as far as the commitments go. And in this curve, there's simply extrapolated forward on the basis of a rapid acceleration in the decarbonization after 2030 to 2100, and that curve corresponds to a 3 to 4 degrees centigrade temperature rise. So simply adding up these contributions is not enough. But simply adding up these contributions, I'm going to suggest, is the wrong way to look at it. These commitments represent an enormous surge in market demand for renewable energy. Each country, 185 countries, have made commitments to increase their use of clean energy, renewable energy on their grids. And that represents a big new market demand. And as the market demand plays through, we are going to see prices coming down. And as prices come down, that will be a positive feedback in lowering emissions going forward. So I think the simple arithmetic addition is not going to be the outcome of that process. I think it'll be more favorable than that. However, the curve, if you can see it on the left-hand side down here in yellow, that's 1.5 degrees with a 50-50 possibility. And the blue and the red curves are 2 degrees, two different analyses of 2 degrees with a 50-50 probability. Right, so both of those cut right through everyone's commitment. I just focus on this. 1.5 degrees implies net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2035, and 2 degrees net zero by 2050. That's roughly the rule of thumb that we should be looking at. In other words, a very short period of time. Now let me have the next slide. Here's the beginnings of the signs of change from Paris. Shortly after Paris, the South African government announced this ambition to put up a very large fraction of their energy production from solar energy in the Kalahari Desert, 9.6 gigawatts. At the same time, India, a somewhat bigger country, announced 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, new renewable energy on the grid by 2022. Right, so this is the big new demand I'm talking about, this big new marketplace. Now, one of the things that's driving this demand through is the lowering of prices that is occurring. Next slide. And what all this curve collects is the lowering that's occurred since 2008. If we take photovoltaic installation, the cost due to the European Union's feed-in tariff scheme has come down a factor of 20, since 1989, when Germany first introduced feed-in tariffs. And what this means is these cost reductions, these are the cost of light-emitting diodes. Why would you put any other lighting in place in cities around the world today? Modeled battery costs, very important as we move towards electric systems operating in ground transport. We can no longer use oil-based transport for ground transport. This is utility-scale photovoltaics, distributed photovoltaics, and land-based wind. All of these prices coming down, and for sunny parts of the world, these are now competitive with new fossil fuel-based energy installation everywhere, within the tropics, everywhere. Now that is the way we're going to win this battle, is even without a carbon price, if we can bring the price of clean energy to be competitive with fossil fuel-based energy. So the new low-carbon energy sector, how well is it doing? Actually, the run-up to Paris was already doing rather well. In 2014, the IEA estimates we already passed 50% of new energy installation globally being renewable energy. And their preliminary estimate of 2015, 90% of global installation of new energy was renewable energy. So we already may have passed a tipping point. I'm going to say there's a very big but, and that is renewable energy, wind and solar, are intermittent. And there are real problems with having 100% intermittency on board. The UK, just saying, we now have 11,500 companies employing 460,000 people in the clean energy sector. This is a very big employer of people. And in the current financial crisis, that's critically important. And then also, turnover, £120 billion a year. That's equal to our food and drinks industry put together. This is the fastest growing sector in the British economy today. So when we boast about our economy growing, it's not growing very much at 2%. This sector has grown 30% in 3 years. It's enormous. So I think we're becoming dependent on this new energy sector. Next slide, please. The money spent on renewable power in 2015 is estimated at £367 billion. Now I'm saying that's going to mount up until it reaches several $1 trillion a year by 2020. Next slide. I finally come to what I came to speak about, and my time is nearly up. So, Global Apollo program is what I initiated with a group of colleagues in London just over 3 years ago. And it took off on the first day of Paris under a new name. Prime Minister Modi did not like the name Apollo, and he introduced the name Mission Innovation. I'm happy with Mission Innovation. And Mission Innovation was initiated by inviting countries to join by promising to double their research and development investment, public funding investment into clean energy by 2020, with the idea that this would de-risk the new technologies emerging into the marketplace for the private sector. So the private sector has the key role of taking these into the marketplace. Now, I'm very pleased to tell you the latest estimate of the sum of money that this will amount to in 2020, with 20 countries on board plus the European Union, is $30 billion a year by 2020. So over the following 10 years, we're talking about investing $300 billion into clean energy technologies through public funding in those 20 countries plus the European Union. And that surely has to be transformational. Now, it won't be transformational on its own. We have to, and this is really why some of us still like the name Apollo, we need to carry that sense of excitement about delivering the solutions. Those solutions are multiple, and we have a short period of time to see that those solutions get into the marketplace. Just as when President Kennedy said we're going to land a person on the moon in 10 years, I would say, although we're saying 20 years, we have 10 years to deliver on this program. What do we need to deliver? Next slide, please. So the mission is, and I point to just the second and third paragraphs, to achieve performance breakthroughs and cost reductions, to provide widely affordable and reliable clean energy solutions that will revolutionize world energy systems. That's what is demanded by Paris. That's what we have to deliver. Now, Breakthrough Energy Coalition was formed at the behest of Bill Gates, and he arrived on that first day in Paris with 28 co-signatories of wealthy individuals contributing together about $20 billion in equity capital that could be put into the new technologies that emerge. But let me say, forming SMEs, which is likely to happen through that process, is not going to be the fast route to getting these technologies into the marketplace. We need large companies to make good use of the mission innovation outputs. And while we've been talking about creating a close linkage between the Breakthrough Energy Coalition Group and Mission Innovation, I have so far made very little progress in creating a linkage between companies, large companies such as the chemical industries represented here, and mission innovation. And I think that's a crucial pathway. Let me have the next slide. If we look at one part of this sector, which is the energy generation, then these are the primary sectors where we need new developments. We need further work on renewables. For example, we haven't yet got paints that will dry to make light-emitting polymers or, more importantly, photovoltaics. We want to be able to paint the outside of our houses and produce electricity from those coverages. There are all sorts of breakthroughs still required in renewables themselves, despite the fact that they've come down in price. Sorry, we've lost everything. I must have overtalked. Let me stress two things. Energy storage technologies. The battery costs are coming down, but the lithium-ion battery is far too expensive to expect that we're going to deliver all of the energy storage at grid scale or at village scale. We need new energy storage technologies to come through into the marketplace. We need smart grids. We need to be matching supply of electricity when it's in oversupply with demand, and that requires smart grid development. We are really very, very primitive with smart grid development at the moment. Britain is going to roll smart meters out into every house by 2020. But actually, smart meter development is also in its infancy. There are many opportunities for development of technologies here. When we come to the business of transport, we need to see enormous developments, not only in the rechargeable battery systems that will drive electric vehicles through into the marketplace. We also need developments into air travel. And when I talk about air travel, I think we have two opportunities. We're going to have to look at second generation biofuels to produce high density liquid fuels, and this is where chemistry comes very deeply into the question. Are we going to use enzymic breakdown of cellulosic byproducts of food products such as wheat and grain, where we don't use the wheat and the grain to create the biofuel, we use the leafy material to create the biofuel? Are we going to develop it in that way? Are we going to alternatively develop air travel using Airship Technology? And what I was hoping to show you was an airship being developed in Britain by a company called Variolift Airships. And these airships are unusual because they are covered with an aluminium sheath, and inside the aluminium sheath of the airship are a dozen balloons which can be filled with helium to raise the airship, or the helium can be pumped back into a cylinder to lower the airship. You can change the buoyancy in that way. But these airships are capable of lifting 200 tons plus of freight, 20 containers, into the hold of the airship. The airship is big. It's 170 meters long, 75 meters wide. That size has an advantage. The helium will lift it up to 30,000 feet without costing any energy, with 200 tons on board. And then how does it shift from picking up tomatoes in Spain to delivering them to the supermarkets in Britain and Belgium? It's covered in photovoltaics and it's driven by electric motors. The photovoltaics at 30,000 feet are intersecting enough sunlight to drive the airship at 340 kilometers an hour. It's not dawdling along. And you're delivering how? Onboard crane. So you simply lower a crate of tomatoes onto the depot of the supermarket. You don't have to land at an airport, transfer into lorries and carry to the supermarkets. There are real breakthrough technologies already beginning to emerge in the marketplace. I'm not saying the photovoltaic stroke helium-driven airship is going to be the market winner. I'm simply giving it as one illustration of the solutions that lie ahead. I'm sorry I haven't got a picture to show you of this airship, but I hope that'll stimulate a discussion into what $30 billion a year investment around the world through a collaborative enterprise might deliver for the private sector. Thank you.